Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. My first thing I'm going to say is one, an apology for starting slightly later than it was planned. That's my fault. And two, sorry that my audio is kind of a bit messed up today as well, because we're just having some issues with my internet and my other computer. So hopefully people are able to hear. I've got a guest today, Mon0. Mon0 reached out to me by email, just saying that there were some kind of points of disagreement that they want to talk about with me. And I checked out Mon0's channel, and there's some kind of cool videos on various topics, but some around the stuff that Alan Sokal did, sort of interrogating, postmodernists during his time in the previous century. I thought that was a really good video. But do you want to introduce yourself kind of shortly for people who might not be in my audience?
Yeah, no, that was a lovely introduction you just gave of my channel. I would just say I'm a researcher in statistical methodologies. Now, I mainly do AI now because everybody that's where the money is for the funds.
Funding, yeah.
Yeah, and so my background is in STEM. Just to disclose that out front. Yeah, and I wanted to chat, especially with Nathan, because I like his content. I like the way he engages in conversations with other political entities, other political people, and I particularly wanted to speak with him because I'm having some weird, not weird, but some controversial ideas surrounding postmodern and continental philosophy, and maybe he can show me the light that I'm mistaken on some of my thoughts.
But by the way, I'm being told by the audience that apparently your mic's a little bit loud. I don't know if you can turn the gain down on the back of the Blue Yeti a little bit. There's like a knob.
Yep. I can do that. Maybe I can. Maybe what?
Or yeah, through the software. However you prefer.
What if I do this? This?
Yeah, maybe that helps. Just let me know what's going on. Hopefully that's fixed it. Cool.
Yeah.
So where do you want to begin on the postmodernism point then? What do you think? What do you think is a good place to start?
Actually, I wrote down some questions I wanted to ask you because I wanted to start with something that I thought was interesting. So I heard you say you're a woke conservative, and I wanted to explore what you mean by that.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess one thing is I kind of like putting those things together because, it's kind of a clash of two concepts for people that's going to be a little bit jarring. And that's partly why I like doing it, right? Is because the hope is that being a little bit jarring will sort of stimulate people to think rather than kind of lash out in a reactionary way in their politics, which I see a lot of people doing a lot of the time. So there's a number of things going on with a term like woke, right? So I think that there are some sort of commitments politically that people who self-identify with being woke would kind of like claim as the content of that term. And then I see like a kind of alternative use, which exists particularly in sort of like an online podcasting ecosystem, which is just to use the term as an othering term for people who disagree, but it's very amorphous. It's not really clear if someone's using the term in this pejorative sense, what the person they disagree with actually believes, right? They could hold to any number of different economic or social views. Often there's a kind of,
That's how I've always heard the term used in basically a derogatory fashion most of the time.
Right.
But of course you don't mean it like that because you call
exactly. Yeah. So I think there's a kind of etymology going back to before a lot of people started talking in this way, probably in the past 10 years or so. And it's connected to, like a movement in music and various social justice movements, particularly in like Black communities, right? Typically, the way that I'm using the term is just as a very thin claim about certain political values that I have. And it's to say that I'm sensitive towards the way that some people have historically been treated, particularly racial minorities. So, looking back to things like the civil rights movement, but then also I might include in that women or gay people, particularly in the UK, there's laws around people being like chemically castrated for being gay in the past and things like that. And so my politics takes these historical injustices into account. But for me, there's no claim there about a commitment to like critical race theory or anything like that. It's just a very thin claim about the type of political values I have.
Okay, so
go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I see, that's interesting. So you think it can kind of have a pedagogical value in the sense that somebody might hear that clash and might be attracted to understand how somebody can hold both a conservative part. By the way, you didn't speak about the conservative word. So where does that come in?
Yeah, I can come on to that. So a part of this as well is going to, depend on what I will freely admit is a slightly heterodox view of politics, right? And so in politics, I tend to reject the sort of, normal two-dimensional axes that you might get on the political compass test or something. I think that's overly simplistic for how we should think about politics. I tend to think of political groups more in terms of people identifying with communities, right? Though those communities have kind of clusters of ideas that they're sort of broadly allied around. So the Conservative Party in the UK is an entity that is, it's historical, it's connected to certain policy choices, it's connected to certain concerns and things. But I think it would be very hard to say, let's put it this way, within the party, there are people who disagree with each other on just about everything. It'd be very hard to identify necessary conditions for being a member of the party. And I think you'd find the same for almost any party, really, any political party in the UK. So when I say I'm a conservative, though, I can point to some beliefs that I have around that. So, for example, I support constitutional monarchy as a system. I'm in favor of protecting the green belt and things like that. I think that I'm quite nationalistic in various ways. I really support the British military. These are sort of things that you might point to as being conservative things that I care about. And also I'd say that I have very responsible views when it comes to how we should think of economics too. Now, I don't think any of these conditions are necessary though. And, someone who's a Labour supporter isn't exactly going to say, I support Labour, by which I mean, I want to destroy the green belt or something like that, So I think we have to be careful, but that's broadly what I mean by conservatism. And then in terms of my political theory, I'd situate myself as looking at the world in terms of obligations that people have towards one another. There's this tradition that is attributed back to Benjamin Disraeli called One Nation conservatism, and that's how it tends to be my outlook and how I philosophize about politics as well. So that's how it all fits together for me.
Okay. So let me just give maybe my views on, because I would never call you woke because, of course, I'm using a different definition. I mean, if I accept your definition, I'm forced to agree with you. But usually it's used in a derogatory manner to talk about people who can't engage in, maybe unwilling to engage in rational argumentation or are dogmatic in their views or kind of maybe hold extreme views that are always on one side of the political spectrum. And in my just how I conceptualize the political framework at the moment in my ignorance of a STEM lord is that there's basically, I see the MAGA movement in America as very similar to the woke movement in the sense that they exhibit some of the same cognitive traits, cognitive rigidity, dogmatism. They get very emotional if you try to challenge their views or say something that goes contrary to party lines. And in that sense, it has nothing to do with your definition of woke, but that's a bit how I conceptualize the political domain. Although this has nothing to do with our conversation, I was just interested to hear your thoughts on what I just said.
Well, I certainly see, that taxonomy that you've just provided, and I see the word being used in that way, right? I think that what I'm trying to do, the move I'm trying to make, is sort of a reclaiming of the term. It's kind of like if you look at, say, the way that the gay rights movement sort of owned a word like faggot or something, or gay, right, when it might have been used as a pejorative by people who wanted to sort of oppose gay rights. And then you had a reclaiming of these labels by people who are in those communities identified with certain values and things. I see myself as trying to reclaim language and use it to furnish my political values with some kind of content. And I don't think I'm on my own here. I see a lot of actually mainstream politicians doing this. Justin Trudeau would be one in Canada. Francois Hollande would be an example in France. Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, who run the leading podcast in the UK, a political podcast, they'd be two examples, one Conservative, one Labour, who both do the same thing as well. So I think that I don't have good data on this. It would be good to do a kind of survey of language use here. But I think the pejorative use actually exists in one particular epistemically isolated community. Now, that doesn't, when I say epistemic, it doesn't mean it's 10 people or something, but it does mean, I think, that it's people on a cluster of podcast shows with one particular sort of view of reality. And I see a lot of people in more mainstream politics actually using the term to mean something more like what I mean, an identification with various social values that are in line with historic injustices or something.
Okay, I see. Because I didn't, I'm already learning some stuff, because I didn't know that woke came from the African American community in America, I didn't know the etymology of the word. By the way, I see you're not shy to drop an F-bomb here and there.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't ask you about. I forgot you're straight into your channel. Sorry, I just realised.
No, I'm. If these words are used in an educational context, not in a derogatory manner, I don't think.
Yeah, it's a use-mention distinction, right? I'm mentioning the words to talk about them, but I'm not using them as with their.
Yeah, I know it's very iffy in academia. That stuff is it makes me a bit sweaty, because it's just risky language. Okay, so.
Imagine quotes around it. I'm mentioning the word.
Yeah. Okay. No, I get it. But yeah. Okay. So, okay, just to close this topic and then go into the postmodernism, because I was interested in your general political background. If I can point to some research that I thought was really interesting, I would point to some research of Tom Costello, a guy in MIT who has done some research on the authoritarian personality. This is some research that goes back to the Frankfurt School, who basically identified some cognitive traits that were associated with having an authoritarian personality on the right. And Tom Costello finds these traits even in the left wing part of the political spectrum. And it's incredible how closely these things match. So there's ways to measure cognitive rigidity, dogmatism, to measure whether you consider your political opponents ontologically evil. That's a big one, and it matches very well in the two sides of the spectrum. And another strand of research surrounding these things that I think is very interesting regards metacognitive abilities. Metacognitive abilities, in the same way, are associated with radical positions on both ends of the political spectrum. And that's generally how I conceptualize the political sphere at the moment. And I'm not sure if it's a good conceptualization. It comes from cognitive science, basically, most of it, where I see the flaws. But this wasn't really what I came to talk about today. If you want to say anything else about this.
The other thing I've got to say about that is that I'm just not that familiar with that body of research, so it doesn't really inform. I'm aware of its existence, but I've not really looked into the data or anything like that much. So it doesn't really impact on my beliefs that much. But maybe there's some kind of blind spots or something as a result in my thinking, which I'm more than open
to. No, well, okay. Well, I just wanted to inform where I'm coming from when I think about politics, because I talk about politics on my channel a bit. So maybe for your audience. Okay, so actually, I've been following the hoaxes done by Sokol and Peter Boghossian that you've talked to, and all these guys on philosophy. And I'm sure you're aware of these papers that have been written and then they've been published in these journals. So what's your general take on it?
I mean, I think that I'm not as familiar with the original Sokal papers as I am with the so-called Sokal squared hoax, right? My understanding, and this is mostly from like watching your video and reading a bit of the book published around the original Sokal issue, is that the findings from that are a little bit more powerful than the findings from what kind of Peter, James, and Helen did. I have a lot of criticisms of what Peter, James, and Helen did from various different angles, and I think that they're criticisms that I've actually seen James at least accept. And then when pressed on these criticisms, this is in the Very Bad Wizards podcast. I think it's around episode 147. And I think it's a psychologist and a sociologist. So they're trained in, statistical methodology and so forth. They kind of challenge him on various grounds. Maybe I should outline some of the challenges that they set forward, which is, for example, the lack of the use of controls. So they didn't use other subjects to compare the subjects that they were putting hoax papers forwards into. So, for example, they could have done the same thing in physics or biology or something like that, and seen is there a difference between physics and the subjects that they're criticizing.
Yeah,
the other thing. Oh, sorry.
Can I interrupt?
If you want to come back on that, absolutely. Yeah.
No, because I was just interrupting you because I have I heard this criticism and I have a big doubt because on the controls. So how would you develop who would develop the control? Because there's a big risk of bias in developing a control for a kind of test. There's not a placebo. So you have to write a paper for a physical or mathematical journal, but there's a bias in that you would want that paper to be published in that journal. So you're going to write it less nonsensically than the papers you're going to write for philosophy. And who's going to check?
Hang on. Well, hang on. This is an interesting point, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Which is that, so if you write a paper in such a way that it accepts the methodological criteria of a subject, right? So it would be seen as a legitimate paper, and then it gets accepted by that Yeah, sorry.
So maybe just for the audience, I'll just recap what we're talking about because maybe we didn't introduce it properly. We're talking about a series of papers that are hoax papers that have been performed by scientists who actually didn't work in the critical theory tradition. Now we're talking about the grievance studies affair, which are a series of hoax paper done by 3 authors, one of which is Peter Boghossian, and who tried to publish papers in the critical theory area of research. And these are hoax papers, and they're meant to showcase that in some way this tradition is flawed or fallacious or have some big mistakes. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's absolutely fine. And to clarify, I agree with the issue that you raised, that it's a genuine methodological issue, right? However, I think that this observation sort of reflects back on what Peter, Helen, and James did in a way that kind of highlights another kind of problem with what they did, right? And this problem is that if you are to write a paper with the intention of getting it published, there's this bias issue, but you're also going to write the paper in such a way that, to the best of your knowledge, it's actually in line with the methods and practices of that field, such that it has the appearance of a paper that can get published. Now, that's what Helen, James, and Peter did in the case of some of the papers. We'll talk about the ones that got published in low-quality predatory journals as well. But when Helen, James, and Peter did that, well, what have they shown, right? It's difficult to say that they've actually shown anything because they've just accepted the field's methods and standards, and then they've been published in that field. But unless you already presuppose that the field's standards are wrong, right? How could you tell that that that's bad, unless you're kind of like already making an assumption prior to doing the study that the field's methods and standards are flawed. And so I don't think the evidence here then can actually show that the field's not legitimate or something like that, and that without making some kind of assumptions from outside of the field that the methods were already flawed.
So let's say there was a field that was in some sense corrupted. How could we go about showing? Because I think the assumption that the papers are so nonsensical that because the a priori assumption, in a way you're right, the a priori assumption is that these papers are so nonsensical they shouldn't be published in any journal of scientific repute.
Yeah. So what I think you would do is you'd have to provide reasons against the methodological assumptions of the field just independently. But I don't think that getting published according to those standards provides an additional reason to show that they're wrong, right? So it would only provide reasons if you already assumed the methods were wrong, which you assumed for other grounds and other reasons. So I think the whole debate, that the back and forth about whether these are good methods, good assumptions to make in a field, whether there's anything being done by the field, like what is the body of knowledge being produced, what are the pragmatic outcomes of the types of theories that are generated, is it a fruitful field? Those sorts of questions, I think, just stand independently of anything that this kind of study can show, really.
But my view is that they start from absurd conclusions, and then they try to write a paper around this absurd conclusion. So that's the a priori assumption. We've wrote something with an absurd conclusion. Now you're right. We're going to use the methodologies, maybe the concepts that are in this area, this domain of thought. And because the conclusion is in some way absurd, this shows that something is afoot.
So I mean, there's all sorts of fields which have sort of like propositions in the main body of knowledge, which to the ordinary person might sound kind of insane, right? You might talk about something like different sizes of infinity, or something like there are triangles whose interior angles don't add up to 180 degrees. Now, to many ordinary people I've spoke with and said these things, they've kind of just assumed that I was wrong or crazy or didn't know what I was talking about when I've said these sorts of things. So now if I go and get in a paper of non-Euclidean geometry, a paper published which talks about triangles with interior angles different than 180 degrees, the average person might suppose that shows that mathematics is seriously flawed, but it doesn't show any such thing, right? It's because that paper is a good paper according to the standards of the field, and the person is making that assessment about the methods and claims in the field without without understanding enough about the field to really make that kind of assessment. And I think that this is the general problem, right?
I see your point. That's actually a great point. That although the conclusion can maybe seem a priori absurd to an outsider, like the fact that there are Aleph null levels of infinity, countable and uncountable infinities or stuff like that, maybe to an insider of a field, so that's an interesting rebuttal.
The thing is, though, I want to hold myself open to the idea that these fields can be flawed. Like, I have criticisms of the fields that they're published in, right? But I think that those discussions about exchanging reasons why the field is bad stand aside from like this kind of study and what it shows. There's a number of other problems with the grievance studies hoax as well that I'd want to get into, which are when they were provided with feedback from reviewers saying that there were problems with the papers, they didn't consider this to be disconfirming evidence, that showed them that there were good standards. And another issue is getting published in low quality or predatory journals, claiming that demonstrates that they've kind of like breached the standards of the subject or something, because one can get a paper on climate change denial published in a predatory journal, or on vaccine skepticism, or that vaccines cause autism. There's all sorts of predatory journals in the harder sciences where people publish papers all the time showing these sorts of things. And we kind of don't use those as examples of the sciences being flawed, but rather, people using the predatory journals is what we criticize there.
This point about predatory journals I find interesting, because I don't have the knowledge of what journals are good in critical theory, but I went and checked the journals in which they published their works, and at least from SciMago, the journal ranks in the usual sites. It seemed like most of the stuff was in Q1, so the first quantile of journals in that area. But maybe, I mean, I
think it's the most egregious. My understanding, and I'll have to look into this again to rejog my memory, but I think there's one particular paper, and it might be the conceptual penis one, that was in like a low quality journal. And then the problem here is then the way that this gets talked about. So it might be the case, the way that this can be presented, maybe there are lots of papers where there's nothing all that wrong with them, right? Or all that crazy about what they're saying. And it's like, well, look, they got into high quality journals. And then you go, well, what was in the papers? You go, well, there's this conceptual penis thing, and that one is in a predatory journal. And then it makes it sound as if all of the papers are like had these crazy contents to them. Whereas in fact, one paper had really crazy content to it and was put in a, got through in a low quality one. And then there's this kind of narrative storytelling thing about what happened, which is actually misleading an audience, particularly an audience that's not in a position to assess any of this data, like on a Joe Rogan podcast or something like that, which Peter did. So I'd have to, it'll be hard for me to get into the specifics right now because it's been a while since I looked into it, but it's these challenges are given to James Lindsay on that Very Bad Wizards podcast episode, and he agrees with all of the criticisms and retreats to the claim that that rather than these showing some kind of systematic flaws with the field, rather they're just satire, right? And you can take satire as you will.
Okay, I don't think you should have agreed with all the criticisms. I don't see how you can construct a confound. Now, this other point of the journals, I would have to look into this too, but I can't see how you would need another independent team that creates a confound. And even then, it has to be some kind of unbiased political team. It's a bit
I think it's a hard study to do, right, if you want to. But this is a thing, right? I think that there are actually all sorts of problems with publishing mechanisms in a lot of the sciences, and my suspicion is that social sciences and critical theory and things like that are probably going to be worse. Actually, that's the way I look at these things. But I think constructing good studies to assess why that is and propose ways of fixing these things, I think that's actually really hard work to do because of all of these biases and those institutions being the mechanisms by which you get published and recognized and things like that in the first place. To kind of make those criticisms is really hard.
Yeah. So one of the things I'll say, because I did read entirely one of these papers, and it was the one on dog rape. It concerned the fact that dogs in parks were engaging in it wasn't hegemonic masculinity, it was something like rape culture, because actually at the first reading I didn't find that paper as preposterous as I was expecting it to be, because I was expecting I was expecting it to be more like the Sokal hoax, because the Sokal hoax for a mathematician or for a physicist, there's some parts which are really preposterous. So they say some stuff that it's immediately just laughable. But in the dog rape one, I think the thing that standed out for me the most is that this researcher was supposed to have looked at dogs engaging in sexual behavior like 50,000 times. So it was an astronomical number of times. That didn't seem believable, because her way of getting the data was to basically go in dog parks and look at dogs. So yeah, the journal didn't So I would fault the journal for that, in the sense that it seems like a really high number for one person who's going in dog parks and looking at dogs. And she's assessing this in a way that is not very rigorous. And in the paper, there are some phrases that do... I don't know how to put this. There are some phrases that seem...
arouse suspicion or something.
Yeah, they arouse suspicion. They're a bit iffy, but they're not as blatant as I wanted them to be. Like, when I read the paper, I was like, actually, I think a paper that's actually more blatant than that one, that is not a hoax, is a paper on the gender of glaciology. There's this...
feminist glaciology.
Yeah, feminist glaciology, and I don't think that paper is a hoax, and I think that is more egregious than the hoax paper in its phrasing. I mean, that was just my impression from reading one of them. I would have to read more of them, but I'm not so dismissive. I mean, I don't know. I don't know exactly where I stand here. I'm not so dismissive about this hoax thing, because I do think there's a problem in peer review in scientific publishing, and I think hoaxes in a way. I mean, I learned a lot from the Sokol hoax. I think I learned from it, and I'm happy Sokol did perform such a hoax, and probably it would be good to hoax even physics and bad math journals. But I think this has been done in some cases, and I think it's positive. If you hoax a predatory math journal, saying exposing its predatory nature, it's a positive.
Well, so I think obviously, I think you and I kind of agree around wanting to improve the standards of some of these fields, and that there being problems for different fields to different degrees. And so, in a sense, there's a sense in which I agree with the conclusion of the grievance studies hoax, right? I think one of the biggest problems for me is the way it's been presented by the authors after the fact. I think that this is sort of an example of bad science communication on a level of sort of, like COVID misinformation, stuff like that. Probably smaller in its effect.
On that level.
Scale-wise, the effects, I think, are less because people aren't dying as a result. But like the magnitude of the scale of that impact, I think, has been really bad. And I think the other thing that I see is particularly with Peter's recollection of the event. So I've seen him say things like, I'm from one of these papers, I'm now one of the most cited authors in this field. Or obviously not his real name, but under the pseudonym. And I'm like, well, look, the paper has been cited a lot of times, but if you look at what those citations are, they're often in journals talking about misinformation and disinformation, right? So it's people who are actually assessing the way that this has been used and the way that it shaped the discourse and the way that, people like Peter have gone on to kind of spread misinformation and disinformation. So it's not really an endorsement of the power of the paper that it's actually contrary to their sort of hypothesis, what they've concluded here. It shows that there are these self-correction mechanisms where people are citing back to the paper to show things that are wrong and try and talk about that and why it happened, right? And also, I mean, this stands aside from the fact that the claim is actually false about the number of citations, because, people like Judith Butler, for example, are way more cited when you actually can tally up the numbers. But so there's all sorts of problems going on here, I think, in terms of in terms of just accurately represent. I think it, like, there are things that it shows, and it's fine to think about those things, but it's the way that it's been represented by the authors here, I think, is very, I would say, actually dishonest. And I think that they've done it to career build, really, and just go around on podcasts sort of appealing to people's prejudices.
Hasn't Peter lost his academic? I mean, probably
he voluntarily quit. He tried to portray himself as fired, but he wasn't. He voluntarily quit his position because he.
That's interesting. Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
I think many people would assume that based off of how he's presented it.
Yeah, I assumed that. Okay, so you're probably more informed about these matters than me, but I'm quite interested. So how did they go about presenting it? So what was it? How did they present it? Because I haven't still studied this issue.
Yeah, so it has now been over 5 years, I think, since I've watched that Joe Rogan episode. So I do not trust my memory on this, but I can talk about more recent presentations of it, such as I think is it Brian Casting, the guy who's got like a physics podcast where he sort of talks to people like the Weinsteins, and he's had Peter on. And this was, I think, last year. Yeah, don't worry, it's okay. I think this was last year. I again find it difficult to say when. And the thing I specifically remember from that was that this was where Peter made the claim that it was the most cited publication in like critical theory journals to Brian and his audience, right? So they're going to form that belief. And you can just like search up the paper that he mentions and find it's not true. The reason I remember this is because the Decoding the Gurus podcast guys commented on this and actually looked at the numbers and looked at what the citations were.
Oh, I like those guys.
False. Yeah, and but if you then compare that stuff to the way Peter presents it, you know, which is just pure like overconfident mockery of the field. He's like, look, it's been shown to be completely ridiculous by me, and they think that this is the best paper ever. It's been cited, and it's like, wow, like calm down. That's not what you've showed at all.
Do you know, by the way, now that it comes to mind that I was watching Peter talk with Destiny, I think, in the Street Epistemology View, and I was surprised. I was surprised. Oh yeah, I saw your one too. By the way, those things are much harder than I think they look, in the sense that if you're an audience member and you think, oh, I would have the right answers to these questions if I was put live in front of a camera, I think it's way harder than people make it out to be. But I was surprised by Peter saying that he thought we had to burn academia to the ground or something like that. Right. Like from a guy that sees many problems. So yeah. if you look at my channel, the highest videos are talking about basically problems in academia. And I definitely see problems, and even big ones if you want. But academia also gives us, gives us so many good things too. It gives us technology. Right. It gives us bodies of knowledge in which we can improve humanity. And these things are still present in academia. And I would encourage people to go into academia. And I was surprised by him being so... although maybe contrary to you, I do appreciate some of the things you do too, maybe in part, but maybe I do a bit more. I was surprised that he would say we have to demolish academia. Like, I don't understand. Like,
well, I think I can provide some insight here, right? There's a number of things going on. And he made a similar claim actually when on one of my streams where he called in, and we tried to point out to him, you know, how there was a kind of inconsistency here, because, for example, when he engages with, you know, the type of people politically he'd want to call woke and say are deranged, right? He would typically say to them, well, when you say all cops are bastard, that's really hyperbolic. It's come on, it's not all cops. We don't want to burn down all the police. We need the police. They do good things. We just want to address, you know, these specific problems. And we tried to point that out, but I think that it's so emotionally close for him.
He did the same thing. He did the same thing. Exactly. That's the same error that people make, is that they take one issue and they get this extreme position regarding that issue. And sometimes it drives me crazy when people do that. I don't understand why can't you, but both of the cops are like defund the police and like defund the police entirely. We can do without the police at all, or burn down all the universities. It introduces, I don't know, this vitriol in political discourse, and it feels like it makes all the discourse worse, that people struggle to talk with each other when somebody does something like that. And I was frankly disappointed by this extreme position that he took.
One thing here, though, is I think there's a sense in which I can at least empathize with some of Peter's emotions here, because I think he was treated poorly by some people at Portland University where he was at, right? And this is partly why I think it's an issue that's very close to him, and why he maybe has a difficult time thinking about some of these things in a clear way, because it kind of is so personal to him. That's going to be
because he is right. Because he is right in some things. Like, there are some issues surrounding academia as a whole, and maybe especially in some areas of academia. So he does come from a kernel of truth in a way, And it was disappointing to me because I think when you fight these kind of political battles, you have to kind of be able to thread the needle and to get your point across to the wider audience. And if you start making a very extreme point, I think you lose a lot of the people who maybe would be willing to support you, or would be willing to say, oh, maybe there is something to be talked about. Sorry, I keep on interrupting you. I'm sorry. I'm just passionate about this.
Don't worry, I get it. I think there are some other things going on here too, though, that it is important for people to be aware of, right? One of which is that Peter has received a $400,000 donation to his nonprofit from Chris Rufo. Chris Rufo is politically connected to the Trump campaign and pushes the whole anti-critical race theory side of politics in America, and why that's so popular stems and originates with Chris Rufo. There's been a number of journalistic articles kind of exploring the chain of events around Rufo's kind of movement into politics and his affiliation with the Trump administration. Another connection that Peter has is he's accepted a fellowship with the Matthias Covingham Collegium. So Viktor Orban, who's a sort of pseudo-dictator in Hungary, he overhauled the old university system and replaced it with a university system that is sympathetic to him, to the tune of billions of euros of taxpayer money. It kind of pushes his political ideology. Part of what he's done here is invite a number of Western thinkers, including Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, Peter Boghossian, Jordan Peterson, to be fellows with the MCC. So Peter went over there and has basically accepted, like free holidays, fellowship, meals, and things like that. And I think that these political connections provide really perverse incentives, whether or not he's aware of them. I think that there's going to be a lot of cognitive dissonance around challenging some of the views he's come to adopt over time here. When you look at the literature around the way that bribery affects politicians' decisions, people engage in self-justification motives because they don't want to think of themselves as bad for accepting bribes. And I think that some of these features now for Peter are definitely going on, along with an effect of audience capture too, because he's been trying to generate engagement on his YouTube channel. He's cultivated this kind of feedback loop between himself and his audience, where he has to engage in, more and more hyperbolic rhetoric and kind of partisan topics. Mm-hmm. And then he's cultivating an audience that seeks and wants that, and then he gets positive feedback for giving them that. And so I think all these effects are coming together to kind of shape where he sits on these issues currently. And that's why you see him talking about burn all the universities down without any kind of room for nuance there.
So you say billions of euros. So the Hungary government.
Yeah. So let me find exactly how much Viktor Orban University costs, something like that. More than 1 billion. That's on Bloomberg. 1.7 billion, New York Times says.
But is it for the whole university in Hungary, or is it dedicated to...
No, the whole system, not just one university, the entire university system in Hungary. All of the academics were accused of being like political dissidents. And also there's no freedom of press in Hungary. People... So there's a great breakdown on TLDR News I'd recommend that people watch, but you can also read articles from, Human Rights Watch about some of these issues too, the way that... yeah.
No, sorry, I'm aware a bit about Hungary. I'm quite ignorant of the matter, but the whole of academia has been indicted as being political dissidents.
Yes, and so there's been a kind of replacement of the original university system with this new system by, I don't know a lot about the details to go into, the exact mechanisms of how that works, but that's one of the things that Orban has done. And I think one guy who's interviewed one of the presidents of these universities on this, and again, I'd have to get I didn't think I'd be talking about specifically these issues around like Peter.
Don't worry.
Facts together, yeah.
No, don't worry. I can imagine. Like, it's not easy to have. Yeah, I don't know, because I don't know what to think about this. So, in a sense, I mean, If what you're telling me is true, it's quite worrying. If you indict the whole of academia as being political dissidents, that seems like extremely worrying behavior. I mean, I hope that I don't know. I'm probably ignorant about it. I hope that what's trying to go on is trying to introduce a broader political orientation in academia, because it's about in academia we're all on the left essentially, and 90% of people, I guess, on the left. And I think it would be a bit better if there was more diversity in the political area.
Sure. Yeah, I think that this is definitely I think this is a separate. I think the thing in Hungary is like very specific to Hungarian politics and stuff. So if I were to just quickly, I think like this New York Times article, right, talks about it. So this was published 28th of June 2021.
Oh, lovely! You can bring up articles.
Yeah. And it talks about 1.7 billion by Viktor Orban, part of a plan to create a more nationalistic society. Critics say it legalized theft of public funds. And so the privately managed foundation, the MCC, granted more than 1.7 billion in government money and assets from Orban. But
does it say, is that, well, I guess we'll have to look into this. I have to look into this.
So yeah, obviously, something to look into that, at least on the face of it, seems pretty troubling, right? But maybe it turns out to be more benign.
Okay. Well, apart from so just to change up topics a bit, if you want. Not really. It's going to be most of the same thing actually. But I wanted to go away from the critical theory side of things, because the way I see it is that the grievance studies was really hoaxes on the critical theory area of academia, and while the so-called hoax and other minor hoaxes have been done on what is the postmodern part of academia. And I think the troubles or the problems in these two areas are very different. I don't think they're the same. I think, just if I wanted to give my small critique as an outsider, is, I think, actually, I don't want to give my critique. I want to talk about postmodern. I want to talk about postmodern, the postmodern side of things. So there's a bunch of academics, including Chomsky, Daniel Dennett, Quine. So there's this tradition in, it's not a tradition, but it's a train of thought. It's a strain of thought in analytic philosophy, probably mostly, that is very critical of the continental tradition, and especially of postmodern philosophy. And I don't know, have you heard anything about this before I say something? Okay, sorry. So basically, they are very critical in the sense that they say that it could be all bullshit. Bullshit, I mean bullshit in the technical academic term of the word, introduced by Frankfurt and by all the papers on bullshit. That means something that doesn't have a true value, that they're stringing coherent words together without the true value. And this, when I discovered this, I was struck by this fact that people in academia, that high-level important figures in academia, could have this thought about an entire discipline. I'm pausing to give you the time to give your thoughts.
I guess I'm not so shocked. I think obviously you have to look at specific quotes from people to kind of see precisely what they're saying and what the contents of their criticisms are. I think there are legitimate criticisms, though, to be made of postmodernism. I think one thing that's going to be sort of difficult here, though, is that, postmodernism as a school of thought or a phenomena, however you want to look at it, is incredibly broad and encompasses a number of things. And I think for me, as someone who self-identifies as a postmodernist, I think some of those things are valuable, through to some of those things being bullshit, right? And so I think that one ought to look at the valuable things and maybe incorporate them into one's worldview, if they can see the value, if it serves them, if it helps them to think more clearly and better about a number of things, and probably see the bullshit for what it is and leave that to one side. So I wouldn't want people to sort of think about these ideas, as difficult as it is, because I think there is a social element to, academia and intellectual thought and thinking about theories and things, to try and leave aside the sort of like my side bias thing of that's what intellectual group do I identify with and who's defined as an outgroup against that group, just to try and analyze like, claims about epistemology or claims about, metaphysics or something like that might come along from some postmodern thinkers and assess them for being good or bad would be my view. Yeah.
Lovely. Wait a minute. I have to charge my laptop. I'm be straight.
Yeah, no worries. I will keep people entertained somehow. I can see a lot of random comments in the chat. If people could try and keep the chat a bit more focused, but if there are specific questions, I can favorite them for later in the discussion too. So tag me if you.
Is there some critique in the chat we should talk about?
Well, there are some that are sort of, I don't know really what to make of this sort of thing. I'm just gonna. That's what I'm saying. Maybe let's just keep it a bit more
focused. Okay. No. So okay. Yeah.
So I was saying there's good and bad, I think, in postmodernism. And I mean, I've not said anything about the sort of proportions there, but I think that we should, try and see if there's any good or bad, rather than paint, a whole school of thought with many people with a broad brush. Oh, and one of your own audience is saying your mic's a bit loud, by the way. I think it is the gain on the back.
I should have just trusted you from the start. Why do I want to engineer another way of doing this?
I think, the gain, I think, is one of them. I don't know which one. Let's see.
Is it better now?
I think it's a little bit quiet now. Maybe somewhere in between.
No, I just moved it like a millimeter. Yeah.
Okay.
What about now?
Let's see. I think it's all right, but let's see what the audience says.
Okay. Okay, so postmodernism. So you brought up something that is often one of the first rebuttals of critics that is to rightfully say, well, postmodernism is this broad thing. There's post-structuralists. It's an entire tradition with many authors in it. And so just labeling an entire tradition like that seems like a bit of a mistake, or a bit of similar to the mistake of Boghossian or people who say defund the police, like this extremist way of viewing things. Yeah. Now, that said, I guess I don't find that critique particularly, that critique or that defense particularly insightful, because I think we all kind of broadly understand that we're talking about Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, I don't know, in some cases Bruno Latour, Judith Butler. So there's a host of authors that are identified with a postmodern tradition, and we broadly know a bit about who we're talking about. And the critique that I think is the more pertinent one that is levied to them is that the way they're writing is to obscure rather than to clarify their thoughts. And you can't, when you read them, you can't identify an argument, first premise, second premise, conclusion, and counter-arguments, and even addressing counter-arguments to what they're saying. And this was something that Daniel Dennett would call deepities. They're engaging in deepities in the sense that they say things that overload the semantic capacity of language in a way that you can extract a myriad of interpretations from what they're saying. And then you maybe arrive to an interpretation on yourself. So, for example, you arrive to an interpretation and then you say, oh, that was a nice insight that you got. But actually, you are the one that created the insight through their semantic overloading of the language.
Mm-hmm.
And when I came across these critiques the first time, so because I didn't know anything about this, and I immediately dismissed it. I immediately dismissed people talking about a school of thought in this way, because I thought it was kind of anti-intellectual in a way. But then, when listening to Chomsky, Quine, and in some cases you can listen to what Bertrand Russell had to say, although he was talking about other authors, but even E.G. Moore, John Searle, I was shocked, but it could be that this discipline needs, it's not a discipline because philosophy does not already have continental postmodern philosophy in it, but that this train of thought could be, I don't know, so egregiously flawed. And we're teaching it, to students, we're teaching it to people in the universities. And that just shocked me as a thing.
Right. I still think the sort of overgeneralization criticism here does land, though I want to also acknowledge some of these issues that you've raised as things that I certainly agree with. I think we can account for some of this in terms of sort of historical inquiry, right? So if we look historically at the postmodernist movement, we find many European thinkers who didn't necessarily speak English or have an interest in reading Anglo-American philosophy. This kind of creates a problem where for some of them, they're also not necessarily up to date with some of the ideas in Anglo-American philosophy and incorporating them into their thinking. But it also creates translation issues where they might be misinterpreting things that Anglo-American philosophers have said and thought. And also, in the English world, when we're receiving back some of their texts, sometimes translation issues around some murky concepts can make things difficult. Now, I don't think that does all the work in terms. I definitely think that there are thinkers who are muddying the waters and talking bullshit too, right? That's something that I'd want to say, but I don't think that that's the extent of what's going on. And then I think there's an important distinction to make too between European postmodernism and the way that postmodernism gets received and taken up in the Anglo-American tradition. And so a movement that I would firmly consider myself an adherent of is ordinary language philosophy, which arises out of the concerns of the postmodernists. It leads to some of the most influential works of Anglo-American philosophy of the past century, such as John Rawls' theory of justice, how to do things with words you can construe as being, and even Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations you can take as a precursor, because that certainly influences Lyotard's interpretations of language when it comes to philosophy. And so there's this kind of big dispute within postmodern thinkers' thought based off of the information they have available to them and that they're incorporating into the sorts of things that they're saying and their geography and the schools of thought that they're situated in. So within the European tradition, I think you'll see some thinkers who I believe are more murky and make more, I would say, outright false claims, because I think that they looked for a theory of linguistics that was grounded in Saussure's work rather than Wittgenstein's. And I think Saussure's wrong, and I think that that's misleading, and I think that led them astray in various ways. But I certainly think that when one looks to the philosophers situated in the ordinary language tradition, and also the Americans in the pragmatist tradition who pick up the work of postmodernism, thinkers like Rorty too, that one can find plenty of very useful observations, particularly pertaining to a word hermeneutics, epistemology, but then also philosophy of science, expertise, in social theory, and how one ought to think of expertise and the role of institutions in producing and protecting knowledge. And I think these are all actually insights that would have a lot of relevance to the types of discussions we were having at the start, right, about how we should think about improving methodology in the sciences too. So that's to highlight some of the things that I think are actually good and come out of postmodern thought, and kind of contrast it with some of the things that I think are bad. I think there's plenty of sort of bullshitting, people trying to talk in deep terms, to present themselves as doing something profound when they're really not. And I would actually say that this is, rather than being, I think it's actually in a lot of fields, right? If I look to machine learning and statistics nowadays, I see so much of this that, the next time that someone says artificial intelligence, I'm prone to sort of blow myself up or something. Or even in physics, often people will get into theoretical physics or quantum stuff and then say a whole lot of nonsense because it's all very deep, or big themselves up, or you can find a lot of, I think, examples of this maybe slightly narcissistic human tendency to overblow what they're doing and want to be viewed as very smart occurring. Now, I think that's to different degrees in different subjects, but it definitely manifests itself in some philosophers and postmodernism.
Yeah, but I certainly agree with a lot of things you say, but in the postmodern tradition, so usually the top mathematicians, the top guys in physics, you don't see, even the top guys in artificial intelligence, when they write their papers, they're very clear. They're not. I've nearly never seen a paper where I think this guy is trying to bullshit. When I'm talking about the top guys in the field, but when I look at the top guys in postmodernism, sometimes I think this guy is bullshitting right now, and he's one of the top guys in the field, and so that for me is striking as a difference. So that for me signals a magnitude difference. Of course, I agree with you that this happens basically everybody, but the magnitude is greater, and I think it's harder to call people out in postmodernism as opposed to math or physics, because in math or physics, you're like, show me the theorem, give me your goddamn theorem, give me your goddamn physical laws. Do we predict well? Do we predict well? Then good. You've done a good job. But when it comes to parts of philosophy, and in this moment I'm thinking about Derrida, because I tried reading some of his texts. That's who I'm thinking about. But I could be thinking about other postmodern philosophers. I'm just left. Another signal that this thing I think is problematic is that experts disagree 20 or 30 or 40 years after his works on what they mean.
Right.
So this is something that does not happen we have other problems, but it does not happen that a top guy in the field publishes, a paper in physics, and then 40 years later, we don't really understand what he meant by what he was saying. So it signals to me that there's a magnitude problem in. I
agree. I think so. The thing I want to agree with is that there is. It's a bigger problem in some of these humanities disciplines than it is in STEM subjects. I think that one issue here is going to be a fundamental difference between the disciplines themselves. And this is something that I'm very critical of in philosophy in general, right? And that is going to be like, what are our standards of success? So there are standards of success in physical sciences, typically, basically based off of the predictions that theories make about experimental results. And then that means that the theories that people generate are connected to the practice of doing activities. And if those theories don't work, the practices don't work. And so you have this sort of selection effect for theories over time. Whereas in the humanities, there's different criteria for success. One problem is going to be that the concepts are contested, right, in a way that they're not contested and operationalized in things like the physical sciences. And another issue is going to be that the standards for success in the humanities is typically going to be something more like being able to go on engaging in linguistic dispute, right? This is particularly a problem in philosophy, which is sort of centralized around people taking a pro or con sort of theory on some position and then publishing papers in opposition to one another. And then, that which as I've talked about with Lance Bush quite a lot, because he studies a lot of this stuff from an experimental philosophy perspective, is that this creates a selection mechanism in academic philosophy for the subject to kind of carry on with these interminable disputes, because it's selecting and pressuring people into carrying on in a discourse where success is just characterized as having the debate, right? Rather than success being characterized in some kind of experimental data or control over the world in some way or something. The relevant sense of control here is just being able to, like, maybe getting a book published or being on stage and talking. And so the fields are fundamentally different in that sense. And there's a degree to which there's not a lot you can do about that because they're doing very different sorts of things. But there's a degree to which I think that the fields can be more, the humanities fields can be more sensitive about that, and then try to, be self-aware about those sort of effects and pressures to mitigate the kind of effects from those issues. So, for example, I think to do more in publishing to promote points of view that are pushing, like, maybe non-standard ways of viewing debates and things like that. And you can talk about all those things. But basically, I think a lot of these issues stem from differences in the subjects too.
Yeah, you're damn right. You're damn right on this point that it's much harder to understand, to have a concrete grasp of measure of success. What's the measure of success in these fields? By the way, love Lance Bush, just a quick call out. So you're damn right. But on the other hand, we must have some standard of rigor. I mean, there must be some standard. And I think it's a bit sad when Sokol, that is a guy that's not in your discipline. So, for instance, there have been people who have made hoaxes or have made bad papers in physics. And usually it's a physics community that rejects them and, like, throws them out. And it's sad when a guy who's another discipline has to make a hoax paper in your discipline to, quote unquote, call you out on the fact that your standards are becoming too lax. Mm-hmm. And the so-called hoax was peer-reviewed. It wasn't, I mean, the journal in which it was published was not peer-reviewed, but it was editor-reviewed, which by 4 editors, which I would argue is an even harsher degree of, by a guy who's been peer-reviewed a number of times, it's an even harsher way of peer-reviewing because the editors of the journal are reviewing it. And some of these editors were some of the top guys in sociology, apparently, at the time. And they accepted the paper. And I don't know, it strikes me as something that these disciplines should be doing more to call out their own rotten apples, or I don't know how to call it in some way. I don't know. By the way, something I was interested in is that you said you're a postmodernist.
Yeah.
And then you said some stuff concerning the value that postmodernism can bring. Could you explain what you mean by that? Sure. Because
yeah, and just to say as well, I think I agree with your criticisms. I think that particularly like academic philosophy, which is the discipline that I'm closest to, can do a better job, and people can be more aware of these kind of issues and should be. Yeah, on what I think is valuable about postmodernism, right? I think that the sort of hermeneutic and epistemology that it can furnish one with is one that can give someone a far more realistic view of the world, right? So what do I mean by that? I mean that our acquisition of language and concepts is situated within history. The way that we use language and think of the world is shaped by our culture. That includes, things like social and economic forces, contingent historical facts where things have gone one way rather than another. And I think that what these sorts of observations can do, particularly when we look at specific cases of using certain theories or concepts, is that it unmasks the sense of inevitability that we might have about conceptualizing the world in that particular schema, right? So I think that many people have a sort of view such that the way that they conceive of things seems inevitable to them. It couldn't be any other way. A woman is an adult human female. Everyone thinks in base 10 number system. 2 + 2 is 4. And that's the way that the world is, right? When one looks at when one incorporates more empirical data into their worldview about the way that these concepts and terms have shaped over time, to look at like the mathematical example, you might look at different number systems that have been used historically, how Romans used to count, and how their notation system and the lack of zero, for example, changed the way that they would think about mathematics or the types of activities they could engage in, versus when the Muslims adopted zero when the Islamic world adopted zero from the Indians, and the way that shaped the mathematics they were able to do, and then the way that was adopted by European and Christian philosophers and changed the way that they were able to conceptualize things. These sorts of recognitions will shape the way that you come to view the field of mathematics, right? Such that, okay, you could still argue for a realist position. It's not like these observations are going to completely, realism destroyed or something like that. But what they are data points that must be incorporated into any adequate metaphysical explanation, I believe. And so it's going to do something, I think, to reduce our sort of tendency to make overconfident proclamations about our conceptual schemas. It makes us aware of the fact that we participate in the modification of our conceptual schemas. And so we must go on with this kind of sensitivity to all of these things as we apply the concepts that we have. I think this is very pertinent to actually topics in cognitive science, right, where people talk about things like 4E cognition or enactivism, which is a view that I'm very sympathetic to. Often in cognitive science, there are terms that have been metaphorically adopted or borrowed from computer science, right? And then computer science has often metaphorically adopted or borrowed those terms from some mathematical field before it. And now the cognitive science and computer science are both so powerful that many of these terms have sort of, gone back into the ordinary world, and you'll find ordinary people, when they come to think of themselves or the human mind or whatever, using these terms in a slightly different way to maybe the way a cognitive scientist or computer scientist would, but still using these metaphors to conceptualize what the human is, what the human mind is. And occasionally, when it comes to constructing theories about the mind and how it works, these metaphors can sort of play a role in making leading to a picture of the mind, or of some capacity of the mind that might be slightly misleading to the way that it does in fact work, because we've borrowed maybe like a non-organic or a non-biological computational metaphor, and so it stunts or limits our capacity to think about this faculty of mind. And I think so that's a specific example, right, where I think, well, it's not exactly specific, but it's an example that applies to a field where I think that these observations for postmodernism can be fruitful for helping us to have an epistemology that's more sensitive to these types of concerns.
Yeah, so that's extremely well articulated. I couldn't articulate it better than that. But the way I've seen, philosophers, postmodern philosophers, actually use these concepts. I mean, maybe these are the most notorious examples, but there are other cases which are better. But some of the ways where I've seen this go wrong is then saying that I don't know, physics is patriarchal in the sense that they use metaphors that have to do with sexual intercourse between male and female, and so it's actually the whole building blocks of physics are corrupted by this patriarchal tendency to insert masculine terms into equations that are actually feminine, and I think that's where I'm lost on this train. So when you said all of that, I'm on board. I'm like, yeah, that seems sensible enough. That concepts in different times, in different historical eras, different cultures, putting them together can create some confusion, even for a student or for anybody that talks about. I mean, artificial intelligence is one of those places where a lot of concepts are borrowed from biology, but then actually neural networks don't really function like neurons in the brain. At least this is what many people think. The predominant thought is that there's not an equivalence between the two things. So I agree with you when you say that, but then I go and look at some of the examples, and it just seems to me that this concept has been taken to a new dimension, but actually completely destroys. I mean, I'm thinking about Bruno Latour now when he was talking about the fact that because tuberculosis hadn't been invented yet, scientists in France couldn't say that Ramses II died of tuberculosis, because that's a modern concept that can't be retroactively applied to how Ramses died. And I don't know if you know this fact.
I don't know about this claim specifically. No. Yeah.
And when I see these things, I'm a bit, as Chomsky is, because Chomsky says, what the fuck are these guys talking about, basically? And when I see it applied in that way, I'm immediately lost. But when I see you talking about it, and I see ways that this can be used to benefit people, but in other ways, it just flies off rails. Yeah. Okay.
I guess I would say I think that a good postmodernist ought to sort of consistently and continually apply these tools of reflection and criticism, especially to those sorts of claims that are being generated, right? The mere fact that someone who identifies as a postmodernist says one thing isn't a reason to accept what they say, and one can think critically about the sorts of things that they say. In the case of this guy who's making this claim about what diseases we can say that Ramses died of. I mean, why not both, right? We can provide a historical. It's interesting from the point of view of the history reader to understand the thought world of a person at the time and how they would have thought of his death, and to understand how we might think of his death today with the concepts that we have. I think both pieces of information can live side by side. And I'd say that as a postmodernist, I'm applying all of the tools of analysis I have available to me to that type of claim that he's making. I'd distinguish between what in philosophy of language is sometimes called like the context of utterance and the context of evaluation. So the context of utterance is the context or the conceptual schema from within which someone's making a claim. And I could say, the context of utterance, from the context of utterance of an ancient Egyptian, of course, it wouldn't make sense to speak in those terms. But I'm evaluating these claims from my own context, which has this medical knowledge. And I can sort of attempt to do both. I can attempt to reconstruct the Egyptian thought world and language and think about what they would think, but I can be critical of that. On the other point, about whether there are power structures like sexism present in our scientific concepts, I do find these claims more interesting. I tend to think that there's sort of more to the criticism. One classic example is in computer science, where you might talk about a particular type of architecture or even Git branching strategy as using, like master branch or master processor and slave processors, right? And I mean, there's an obvious sense in which that metaphor that's being employed clearly is borrowing from, the concept of master slave in like slavery and human slavery, because the master is driving the others, right? So there's a sense in which it's conceptually borrowing something metaphorically. But I think one can sort of reflect and analyze things even in that case where they recognize the concept might have harmful connotations, just in terms of like, how much harm does it do? Are people able to kind of like distinguish between the practice of human slavery and a chip that they're using? And maybe it would turn out that for some people who are more closely connected to, human slavery today, that actually that use of language is harmful for them. And that might persuade, people who can't see the problems to go, yeah, actually, do you know what? It's not that big of a deal for me to change my language, or maybe it doesn't. And we can, but I think that being open for this kind of evidence sensitivity and reflection on the topic rather than dogmatic is a postmodern attitude to have.
So first of all, I must say that unlike the postmodernists I read, you're very clear and sensible, I think, on what you're saying. But it does strike me as kind of ironic that you would bring up this thing as being maybe a matter of concern of this language of a slave stuff when you dropped the F-bomb at the start of our conversation. And by the way, I think it wasn't anything bad at all. And I don't see how then we can say that this language in programming is going to be, I don't know, I don't know what's the problem. I don't even. Is it going to be? Is it going to offend some people? Is it going to be? Some people are going to take it to heart.
Know. I'm sort of using it as an example, right? But I'm saying, like, I can at least see that it's not like the language master and slave sort of came out of the Platonic a priori. It's being used here to refer to some kind of like power relationship between one processor and the other, or like a hierarchy of information processing between one processor and the others. Now, the concern might be, and I'm just kind of, I'm not taking a stance on it, but more just leaving it open, that because of that conceptual relationship, maybe people who are involved in human slavery today have a hard time in computer science because they're talking about this thing that's really harmful to them personally, and they have to use this kind of language, right? And then I don't know, but I think if I found out that there were some people who had been involved in modern day slavery and then tried to become computer scientists, and they were forced to use this language and it was really upsetting for them, then I'd be like, do you know what? It's not that hard for me to just use, like, that's the main processor and these are the child processors or something instead. It's not like it's not a hill I need to die on. Whereas maybe I could go the other way and it's like, well, actually, no one really cares. Yeah, we adopted it metaphorically, but everyone's an adult here and we can all see that we're just talking about processes and not kind of slavery here, human slavery. So it really is an evidence-sensitive point of view that's context-dependent. Maybe I'd kind of adopt both views, and if I'm working with someone who actually was involved in human slavery or something like that, I change my position in that context and then not in a more broad context. But I think that is the type of response that's available to me because of the hermeneutic and epistemology that I'm adopting. It's very context sensitive and very information sensitive. It's not kind of like dogmatically proclaiming some kind of generalization here about what's right and wrong.
Okay, I get your point. And what I would just say to this is that I think your acts, the way you act, not also how you speak, but demonstrates that you understand what you're talking about. As I was trying to evidence before. But when I read postmodern authors, that this is not what they say in most cases. Their attacks are more vitriolic in the sense that they say that the endeavor of physics in some cases maybe is patriarchal or masculine in a way that is corrupted. While you're saying a much more sensible thing that, in my opinion, is, some words could result in people being offended by it, or people not being offended, maybe just they're sad. They hear a word that reminds them of something in their past, and it can be off-putting, okay? And I would say, yeah, that's something that can happen, actually. If we name, a certain function, I don't know, like fat pig, or... Oh no, I think okay, or something, or a swear word, or something insulting like that. Then they were like, we should change that. Why do we have to be off-putting to the student or to somebody learning? And so what you say, I basically agree with. And you seem, but when I go and read the text, you're reporting a good interpretation. What I would claim was a good interpretation of a text. So you're taking the best, your best interpretation out of it.
Yeah, and I agree with you that, like, there are many of these authors who I would say, go too far in their conclusions, or they're overconfident in their conclusions, and I think one can still find good observations in some of the tools that they are sort of building and creating that one might want to adopt, even if they're overstating the case or going too far or doing something mistaken, right? So I think that's done by good philosophers today. So there's a philosopher I really like called Hasok Chang, and he does a lot of work looking at the history of science, and he looks at lots of sort of like flashpoints of theory choice and the competing theories that people were building at the time. And there's often quite a deep connection between like social economic concerns and machinery and apparatus and the language used for those things, which is often driven by, like the economic and industrial adoption of the apparatus and the sciences too, that then will inform sort of the way that we conceptualize and think about certain terms, and can become even embedded in the way we conceptualize things after the apparatus it used to refer to has kind of died off, right? So an example that I often give, and it just sticks around off the top of my head, is like of temperature rising when we no longer use mercury thermometers, right? And we're kind of adopting this metaphor of rising because of the apparatus that we use to measure the phenomena that we were trying to kind of operationalize and build the science around. But there's no real sense in which, you know, the mean molecular energy of the molecules around us is rising. I mean, maybe you could talk about convection currents rise or something like that, but I don't think that that's what's being referred to. It's the act of the mercury going up and down, and you could have a thermometer that went the other way, right? You could place it upside down and still measure it, because of the expansion of, well, the gravity a bit. But point is, you can do it, and so, you know, I think that now this isn't maybe this isn't an example of a value-laden kind of concept particularly, but I think that we can still interrogate these concepts of science and see where we fall. And it's this methodology of the sensitivity to the history and the contingency of our language use and the very human connections to our language use too, that can then drive us to thinking more carefully about the way we construct and build theories today, and also even the way that the sciences connect to us as humans and society at large, rather than just as kind of almost this Platonic form of truths that people are constructing or something. And I think that is a very realistic view, and it also, in a way, actually protects the sciences from when people become disillusioned with them when they're embedded in them, or they find these problems and they think, oh, hang on, it doesn't hold up to this like kind of Platonic ideal of the sciences that it was being presented with, and then so they throw the whole thing out the window. I think having this very realistic view has a lot of benefits for people actually as well, and we can throw out some of the more maybe radical claims if we think that they're wrong, but still see the good in, you know, some of the attempts that are being made to understand these things.
Okay. So, there's a number of things I would actually like to explore. I find it really interesting talking to you. So probably the most pertinent fact is something that pertains to my personal experience regarding these things. So do you know this channel on YouTube called CCK Philosophy? I
think so. Is that Jonas Seeker? Is that the guy?
Yeah, Jonas Seeker. So he makes these beautiful videos on postmodern philosophy, and I confess I was and I still am in part a fan of his, in the sense that I watch his videos, and 6 or 7 years ago I would watch his videos, and I would feel like he distilled some of the thoughts of contemporary philosophy, of postmodern philosophy, and put them in a video, and I appreciated it, and sometimes I learned stuff from the video of what postmodern philosophers actually thought. And the problem I see in this is that when I discovered this strain of thought in academia, that is not, I wouldn't say it's major, but it's there in the analytic tradition, that criticizes the postmodern philosophers based on how unclear and obscure they're making things. I went back to try to read some postmodern philosophers, and then I realized that Jonas Seeker, or CCK Philosophy, was given his interpretations, but sometimes were the majority view of interpretations of what these philosophers said. But there's all this hermeneutic effort that's been employed to decipher these texts, to then give them in a palatable form. And I would just warn a listener who sees people talk about continental philosophy. I mean, I would have wanted this warning in the past, that you might not find all this knowledge in the actual text. There might be actually more knowledge in the summaries of interpretation of the text given by others than in the actual text of these authors, because it's extremely challenging to read, and it might not be challenging in that sense. It might be, it's not clear if it's extremely challenging or if it's actually something that you can't comprehend. Okay, so I would like to give this warning to myself 3 years ago, but now I don't have it, just to maybe not embark into trying to even read some of these authors. And
yeah, I agree with that. I think a lot of it's. I think a lot of the like almost original text supremacy, I might call it, of you've got to go back and read these really dense works written by random French people in the middle of the last century. I think it's kind of a false horizon. Like you sort of go and maybe put a bunch of effort into doing that for a bit, and you're like, I'm really getting nothing out of this. And I don't think that it's always just a skill issue. I think that sometimes there just isn't a lot there. Right?
It's a skill
sometimes
issue.
There is. Sometimes there is, but not all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a skill issue. There was something else I wanted to talk about you with. It just evaded my mind at the moment. There was something else. Well,
no worries.
This...
Postmodernism, philosophy of science, concepts. Yeah, have you got it? I don't...
Oh, no, by the way, how much time do you have?
Oh, I'm good for time, don't worry. Yeah. I've got.
Are you enjoying this? Do you want to stop?
Yeah. No, okay. I'm fine. It's all good.
Okay, great, lovely. Actually, it didn't come to mind, but I have another thing I wanted to chat with you about, just because I find it interesting. So in these culture wars, in these circles of us people on the internet talking about this stuff, being very pompous and mighty in a sense, there's this idea that's been floating around, not very rigorous, but it's called the substitution hypothesis. Have you heard about this?
I don't think so, but maybe some more details.
Yeah, so the substitution hypothesis is the hypothesis that essentially humans need a kind of religious foundation to orient themselves in the world, or to give them value, to give them meaning, and provide spiritual guidance, and to provide for human flourishing. And because we had a historical period with the four horsemen of apocalypse, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, etc., Daniel Dennett, that ushered in this era of atheism, and our societies are declining in their religious credence. Then something had to come in to fill this void, to substitute for the religious that was lost. And of course, I mean, usually these people always say that it's one thing that substitutes, and it's woke ideology. I don't exactly know what that means, but in principle, I think the substitution hypothesis doesn't really discriminate. It would be that anything could come in and substitute for the religious foundations. And so have you got any thoughts about this?
I think just what's fresh in my mind on the woke point, I would provide a lot of pushback to the idea that what accurately characterizes woke politics is something like, some sort of religion that's overtaking, that's moving in because people are becoming more secular or something. And I think that this kind of falls out of my analysis of how I see wokeness being used by critics of it, which is just predominantly as this amorphous pejorative that doesn't really, have any discernible content other than that the person disagrees with you, such that, I find it really hard to sort of classify a gay rights activist at a pride march, the Free Palestine protesters who are at the university down the road, and maybe, some feminist at a corporate job who's concerned about having some like feminism thing at her job, all as being part of the same religion or something. I think that I would, look at each of them as having separate values, different concerns, different, I really think that that's the wrong way to analyze that. And I don't really think any of them are doing that because the world is secular and, they're looking to fill some religious void in their heart. I think that if society were more Christian, you would just find the Free Palestine protesters using theological language to describe their protests outside the university and talking about, God's justice and providence and so forth. And you would find, maybe the feminists doing the same thing and the gay rights activists doing the same thing. I think that people use, when they're religious, theological concepts for all of these ends. So that's the first point I'd want to just push back on, is that this kind of story about that explaining why we're hearing lots of wokeness talk. I think particularly the people who are listening to these podcasts are hearing a lot of wokeness talk because they're listening to these podcasts where people talk about wokeness a lot. I mean, that's how I characterize it. But when it comes to when it comes to the question about religion, it's going to depend how you characterize religion. I tend to take a naturalist outlook towards religion, where I view it more as a social phenomena. So it's quite hard to define what exactly it means, but it's something like, social community gathering organized around rituals and practices, storytelling and shared values, something like that. It's not going to be exactly that in all cases, but it's some kind of combination of those sorts of things, right? And so I think one can actually, under that umbrella, classify political allegiances as being religious, or even view them through that lens in many ways. One could view political parties or membership of political parties and going to local clubs, or allegiance to a political party, as kind of being like that. In fact, a lot of the psychology of like cult literature talks about this. Where do you draw the boundaries around a cult, and can you view political organizations or even corporations, like when someone's part of a company like Google or Apple or something, they adopt lots of in-group language. Their worldview is kind of shaped by the adherence to this organization. There's thought control techniques that take place, and it becomes very difficult to kind of draw the boundaries around the things that you want to include and the things that you want to exclude in a principled way. Sorry. Is there you want to say on?
No. So you would reject this hypothesis because you don't think religion fits the bill, and you don't think you can give a coherent picture of wokeism. That you can't like give some guiding tenets of being woke.
Yeah, I guess that's one part of my criticism, and I think I would say, though, in the case of explaining this phenomena of wokeism, I mean, I don't think that there is any such thing. The phenomena of wokeism is like some well-defined concept. That's one issue. But I think even if there were, this wouldn't be the best explanation of what's going on, right? That they're filling a religious-shaped hole in their heart or something like that.
Okay.
So there's kind of like two levels of criticism there against that type of explanation. But more generally, do I think it's true that people seek to replace one religion with another? Well, I think that model of like one religion moves out and another moves in is wrong. I think that viewing people as social and quite dynamic is maybe
somebody being murdered.
Sorry, I live next to the main road, so yeah, a police car.
So, no, because it's been like it's not the first one. Like there's been like, are you in a high crime? Are you in a high crime area?
There have been 2 stabbings on my road in the past 2 weeks. So
wow. I apologize. Sorry.
But it's a main road. It's a main road in London, so like you've got a lot of people going.
I guess somebody should super chat or donate something to get you a better accommodation.
Security. Yeah, that's true. And the internet's not working. That's why my audio is messed up. Yeah.
No, sorry. You were saying.
So just I think that a model of what's going on is not. It's not that people are like losing one religion entirely and then replacing it with another one or something like that. Instead, I think that what's going on with people, I think religious allegiances are more like social, communal, value-based allegiances generally, and they're more flexible and in flux and driven by very different patterns than like this idea of like a Lego brick that is just swapped out for another one. And that's what I mean by, if for various reasons some kind of religious view like Christianity were more powerful or more widely accepted in British society today, I think people would just make them consistent with these other values around, being pro-gay rights or pro-gay marriage, pro-women's ordination, maybe in favor of supporting the Palestinian side of the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think people have always done this, right? And then people's reasons for not being religious are more historically contingent. And so they would not be religious and make sense of their values in a secular framework instead. And so I think that more accurately characterizes what's going on, with
you would say it's more of a value substitution, not a religious substitution, but more of an in-group value substitution. That if somebody loses his values, then he has to adopt another set of values. Yeah, okay, great, because I really agree with that. I think that if you can't really orient yourself in the world without having at least some values you hold to go about. So if you lose some values, and in my personal life, I actually went through exactly what they're talking about, not in the religious sense. I agree with you of the critiques of religion. I don't think it's religion is the right way to conceptualize this. In my personal life, I started as a theist, then I became an atheist, and I was at a loss of values, actually. I didn't know how to orient myself in the world when I was very young. I lost my religion because religion gave me a way to orient myself. And when I lost my religion, then what happened is that because my philosophy teachers maybe were more on the postmodern side, and then when I went to academia, I can't explain why, but I had my values were more that of moral relativism and epistemic relativism, and the value of tolerance and empathy. And those were my bastions in a way. That's how I oriented myself in the world. And it was very hard for me. It was very hard for me to orient myself by holding a position of moral relativism. I don't think I was happy with that because it was basically based on a tolerance for other cultures and understanding that everybody has a different morality. I have mine, they have yours. No value is really right in itself. It's just you have to adapt to this fragmented world. And it was just really hard for me to orient myself in a world where I would continuously think my value is only relative to other things. There's no real good, it's only relative. And luckily, I went on to study moral philosophy because this thing was so important to me that I had to go and study moral philosophy. That had nothing to do with what I was doing. And then I discovered the works of deontologists like John Rawls, like Rawls, and utilitarians like John Stuart Mill, and I adopted at the end one of those philosophical positions normatively and in a certain sense even metaethically, but I don't want to go there right now. And that really helped me. It really helped me cope with the world and helped me orient myself. And I was a much happier person after that. I adopted a different normative position than one I had before. And so in this way, I see the substitution hypothesis. I see that there could be a kind of substitution hypothesis, but in values. And the way to, I think, overcome this is not to go back to religion, but it's to introduce more moral philosophy. Like people, in my view, people should be studying more moral philosophy, because if you lose your values that are given from religion, then you're gonna probably need another way to orient yourself in the world. And moral philosophers have thought about this in a not religious framework, and they can provide something like that to you for your life. Does that resonate with you? Or?
Sort of. I mean, I think I've got a more complicated relationship to this because of my overall criticisms of what philosophers take themselves to be doing in general. And so I'm very disenfranchised with a lot of the discourses that exist in moral philosophy, whether it be like applied ethics, normative ethics, and particularly meta-ethics. I've got quite substantive issues with all of these. That being said, I wouldn't disagree that some education on this could actually help a lot of people. And there is some empirical evidence backing this as well, of studies that have been done with children in schools and how it helps them to think about
really? I didn't know any.
Yeah.
Can you pass? I'll ask you for them afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. It's where I'm recalling this from is in Stephen Law's very short introduction to humanism book. And he cites this study, so I'll find it for you, where kids in primary schools were taught some of these classes versus like a control group, and then they scored higher on like critical thinking tests and things like that as a result of reflecting about these things, and had different self-assessments and things. So I think that there's some, I mean, I don't know how strong those effects were and things like that, but I mean, there's some evidence here that seems to suggest it'd be a good thing, right, to have that, a good sort of thing to have on a school curriculum or something, so people were better situated to think about these things.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I guess I've run out of stuff to ask you.
Cool. Well, no worries. That's all good. There was a question earlier someone put in the chat. Let me see if I can find, which was Lego said, do we expect postmodernism to come up with clear explanations of how language interacts with the culture and context? I certainly think it should be in the business of producing better theories about these sorts of things. Of course, that's not what always happens, but as long as we're discussing like what should the norms of like philosophy or critical theory be in terms of what people aspire to do, and the types of things that people are looking to get published, well, it should be producing better theories that do this sort of thing, right? Explain the nature of this relationship and provide us with clarity. Yeah.
Well, to answer the chatter, I would say that when Nathan, when Nathan was explained these things in the course of this conversation to me, he was very clear, in my opinion. And he was not only clear, he was also sensible. That's another topic. But he gave a clear explanation. If you go back to the text of Derrida, I bet you 1,000 to 1 that it's going to be very hard to find clear explanations as one that Nathan gave in the course of this conversation. Maybe that's just my experience. Maybe maybe my STEM brain. It's possible. No, I'm not being facetious right now. Maybe it's possible that my STEM brain just can't grasp the intricacies of what's going on in a postmodern text. Of course, I have my reasons to doubt that, but it's a possibility that when Nathan explains it to me, I understand it quite easily. So in a sense, the answer is yes, I do expect clear explanations. And if I don't, maybe it's me who's stupid, but maybe it's something else. And because this is a question that I would have asked 2 years ago, by the way. It's something that I think is perfectly sensible to ask, because in a way, if you're going to read some of the works on mathematics, or even some of my works, a layman wouldn't be able to understand what's going on. And he would need years and years to understand what's going on. So maybe that's what happened. So what I always thought is that that's what's happening with me. Of course, if a layman is going to read a paper in higher mathematics, it's going to take 3 or 4 years, even more, of study to be able to reach the point of knowledge to comprehend the deep truths that are in this paper. Maybe that's what's happening to me when I read the text of postmodern philosophy. Maybe I haven't done all the prerequisite steps, 4 or 5 steps, to reach that deep understanding of a subject, to understand what's going on. But then, when I go and see people in the philosophical tradition, and I see the doubts they had, or for how example, they didn't want to accept Derrida as to giving him a Cambridge honor. There was a big petition that was signed by thousands, maybe that's an exaggeration. It was signed by some philosophers, and among them there was Quine, and it was a bunch, and they didn't want to give Derrida an honorific through Cambridge, because they thought that his work was, I don't know how to put it kindly, but some of them would use terms like fraudulent or like nonsensical. And so when I see those things, then I get worried, because I'm like, experts in the field are raising a flag of concern here. And so in a sense,
my criticisms of things, I would say personally, and though I similarly like many of the observations that Quine made, but I think that there are some papers written by Quine which I would accuse as being, as stark examples of like a kind of needy philosopher being overconfident, using specialist terminology that doesn't have any pragmatic success simply in order to try and appear intelligent. Like I think that those things can be put into within the analytic tradition as well in a similar way. Probably, I think the frequencies are different between some of these like French philosophers and, some of the analytic philosophers, but I think there's a lot of that going on.
Really? That's kind of depressing. That's kind of depressing to me.
Yeah.
But it's going on,
yeah.
but it's rampant, basically.
Well, I think the reason that maybe it's not as apparent to people who are more into like STEM fields, right, is because when analytic philosophers are doing this, they're wearing the drag of STEM. They're typically adopting mathematical notation and language and notation because basically my view is that they're seeing the success of the sciences and how well respected they are, and then trying to stand, on their shoulders, as it were, or make it look, do like what I've termed sort of like cargo cult thinking, where they're like, well, if I go through the motions that they're going through, then I'll be doing the same thing in philosophy. It'll be as rigorous, it'll be as kind of serious. But oftentimes they're really just dressing up, the same claims in like set theory notation or something. And there's no real difference between if they'd written it in ordinary prose or use these tools, because the tools of these mathematics aren't being connected to the empirical data, empirical practices in the same way they are in sciences. That's why I would say they don't have the same kind of power and usefulness.
Yeah, there is a problem of going overboard in the sense that you could be using too much symbolic logic to say something that I think in Principia Mathematica, to reach 1 + 1 = 2, Bertrand Russell employs, I don't know, like more than 10 pages. And from set theoretical axioms, I don't remember actually how they start off, but yeah, there's a way in which you can overcomplicate something just for the sake of complication, and that's bad. That's bad. I would even say that's very bad. But if it's correct, at least if I employ, I don't know, 10 days of my time, I can reach the conclusion and I can say, you did all this just to say that. And why did you need to introduce more symbolic logic? Well, in the case of some continental philosophers, so maybe there's something I don't understand. So how can you start without giving definitions? So sometimes you start talking about concepts or languages without a definition of words, and you introduce new words without defining them, and it creates this problem of interpretation. Okay, I'm just going on to the same thing. That's my.
Well, I agree. I agree with you. I would encourage people who write in that way to write in a slightly different way. I think that there can be an unhelpful then over obsession in the other direction on definitions, right? Which just gets you stuck in a discourse about how to define terms and conceptual analysis, where, okay, how do you define this word? Well, an entailment of that is this, so provide a new definition, and then they do, and then it's a counterexample. And I think that language actually works not in that sort of way where there are sharp boundaries to it, but in a more kind of loose polysemous way for the vast majority of terms that's very context sensitive and stuff like that. So I think that the idea that providing definitions would do that is to expect too much. But to the degree that people might be introducing vocabulary or saying things that people might be unsure with, I think aiming for as much clarity as possible is something that people should do. And I would encourage, strange European thinkers to do the same thing, because it's something that I believe is useful. Now, they might disagree with me and provide me with reasons, and that's fair enough. But that's how I think about it too.
I'm still on. Okay. Are there other questions from chatters?
I can't really see anything in particular.
Do you, Nathan, have some questions for me, or even criticisms on my channel, or things you think I could be doing better? I don't know.
I mean, not really. I think actually one thing would be praise, right? In the sense that you found someone like me who disagrees with you and sought out to have a conversation with me, like a respectful conversation where you talk about points of disagreement and try to sort of like build your views on that basis. So I think that that's a really good thing. I don't see a lot of people doing that, or even respond, often I see people more reflexively responding to points of disagreement rather than thinking about them. And I think you thought about a lot of the points that I've made and have, tested and incorporated them into things that you're thinking at the same time. So just to kind of praise you, say I really appreciate that approach, because I don't think there's enough of it.
Well, thank you very much. And I do try to research a lot for my videos, and I have a lot of doubts on, I don't want to be a burden on society. Like I think like what I do should have a positive effect. And let me just give some compliments to you, because I didn't just ask to talk with you randomly. I watched your videos and I saw you. I mean, you exhibited all the traits of a person that, in my opinion, is willing to engage in rational argumentation, is willing to have a conversation with another individual. But maybe there might be some disagreements, but we can talk about these disagreements. And at the end of the day, we can have a better idea of what our disagreements are, and the audience can even gain something from us two talking with one another. And in this era of politics, where we're so goddamn polarized, and the polarization keeps on increasing, and I'm scared about that. I think people like you are really needed, in the sense that we need people on both sides of the political spectrum to engage and, I don't know, talk about these issues. And I'm actually so black-pilled about this, because when I look at the political environment, it's so fucking annoying, in the sense that it's because the monetary incentives is to just scream at one another and to just adopt the most radical positions from one side or the other, and then champion them to the end of the world with all these. I mean, I don't know if it's even the fact that people are grifting, or more the fact that all the incentives are in a direction of non-sanity. In the fact that you have audience capture, so the algorithms push you in that direction. Then there's the monetary incentives push you in that direction, because audiences of reasonable people are usually smaller than people who, make a big fuss about things and make things controversial and, engage in screaming matches all the time. And sometimes I just look back on all of this, and I'm saddened about how we discuss these issues. And hopefully I'm doing something in the right direction, and I think you are. And but it's not only you and me. There's other YouTubers, other people who I really think are trying to heal the divide, even that is in our society. I don't know. Sorry.
No, I agree. I mean, I agree with you there. I think there's going to be like some sort of context-dependent issues as well, depending on like the politics in your specific country. So I don't know where you're from. Are you Dutch or like somewhere else? I guess.
Oh, you noticed. I noticed. No, I don't disclose anything surrounding my.
Okay,
but you noted.
That's all right.
Good job. Okay. Good job noticing. I'm not.
So obviously, if it is Dutch, I don't know, but like it's a slightly different parliamentary system, and then you slightly different issues even being in mainland Europe. So like the problems around immigration are slightly different. Problems to do with agriculture are slightly different, right? And there are some common features to all of these, the politics in different countries. So like in the Dutch parliamentary system focuses more on people kind of like cooperating for a period of time and agreeing what they plan to do in a particular term of government, more so than I would say the UK parliamentary system. But then people have to vote in line with the party, or they'll kind of get kicked out by their own party if they don't vote in line with the whips. So you really only have one chance to vote against your party, because you'll be getting kicked out that time. So different systems have different incentives, is what I'm saying, and those can be good or bad. And you have to look at them on an individual basis. But the features that are common here, which I think you're right about, are things like the way that we use technology interfacing with our belief formation. So, companies that try to steal our attention and keep our attention by getting us emotionally riled up, getting us addicted to more and more enraging content. And then the way that interfaces with our rationality, so it tends to bypass it. It tends to force us to form opinions about things in an emotional state without thinking about them carefully. I've also seen some interesting research from the University of Amsterdam around polarization and the fact that people interacting with each other more from different points of view leads them to polarize along more axes, because issues that previously wouldn't have been thought of as politicized tend to become politicized as they interact with people in online spaces where they are politicized. And then, as you say, like incentives for content creators to keep people engaged by pushing on these emotional issues. A guy called Pine Creek, who's in the chat, has been recently boasting about how he's managing to get millions of views from creating these shorts where woke people say stupid things. I mean, I don't think that that's doing a whole lot to actually improve people's thinking about these issues or make them more informed citizens or anything like that.
Yeah, you're the problem. You're part of a problem, you chatter. You, okay?
I think it's difficult. I think we shouldn't be overly ambitious with what we can achieve through what we're trying to do. But I mean, I do genuinely think that the onus of responsibility is also on us as individuals to participate in society and try and defend, democracy and the values that we have politically, because it's not guaranteed, I don't think, that, the kind of liberal democracies or constitutional democracies around the world will be the kind of mainstream form of politics going forward. And I think increasingly, geopolitical instability and issues like climate change and economic concerns drive people towards, wanting authoritarianism and certainty and strongmen and things, and that shapes and changes politics in these negative dimensions. So I think it really is on people who care about these things to continually, fight for democracy and the political, and be civically engaged in all the ways that they can be. Yeah.
Lovely. If I would be happy to do this again on any other topic, and
yeah, absolutely.
And if there's something you disagree with in some of my videos, call me out and we can chat about it. Any other chatters want to say something?
Yeah, I don't really see any specific question comments. People laughing at me dunking on Pine Creek. And some
okay, we've seen one of my chatters, but he was just adding relevant information.
Isn't woke ultimately a relative term adopted in ignorance of how awake? I think it's complicated. I say at the start of this conversation, I talked about some of the things I think it comes from and different ways it's used. It's kind of complicated, is my answer.
Yeah, we have two different definitions of woke, but in a way, I think Nathan's one is more academic. I don't know. It's more historically accurate, while mine is more culture wars dependent, in the sense that woke is a derogatory terminology, but it's not a question of definitions, in the sense that Nathan calls himself woke, but I don't consider him woke in the sense that I see how the world is, because just a definitional problem, really.
Aaron says postmodernism for you is just about language use. I'd say the bits that I think are good and adopt are related to epistemology, hermeneutics, some kind of metaphysical claims, and have a heavy focus on language. I say that more of my views on language then get shaped by linguistics too. And I wouldn't say that postmodernism is just that. There's obviously like a kind of whole cultural, political, and artistic set of movements with as many divisions and controversies and things are all sort of loosely related to one another. And I don't necessarily like postmodern art that much. Sometimes it can be interesting, but yeah.
Would you say a part of postmodernism is adopting a kind of epistemic relativism or moral relativism?
I think that it's anti-essentialist, right? So in the sense that essentialism gives you a kind of certainty and typically a view where some view is clearly the correct view and some view is clearly wrong in sharp, distinct ways, it's against that. I don't think it has to lead to, I mean, it can be relativism in a particular kind of way. It can be relativism in an extreme sense. But what I'm saying is there's different scopes of relativisms, right? And there's extreme relativism where someone might make claims where they don't have any confidence in the types of things that they believe and stuff like that. And I don't hold to that. And actually, the language I tend to use more now is pluralism, because I think that the way that I view the world is that there are a bunch of different empirically adequate schemas that can be applied. There are some schemas that I would say are not empirically adequate. They can't make sense of either our ability to control the world, so pragmatic success, or our experience and the phenomena that we sort of like empirically observe. And so, some theories are sort of out the door on that basis. Of course, someone could reject those values and land in sort of absurdist territory or whatever. I don't. So I'd say, like, on the one hand, you've got this kind of spectrum, right, from pluralism through to sort of this absolute crazy relativism. I put myself more towards the pluralism and end of that spectrum, but it is it's anti-essentialist, it's anti-natural hierarchies and things like that, typically construed. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, when I was younger, have you heard? This is going to be fun. So we didn't talk about Jordan Peterson's conception of postmodernism, because he has his own critique, which I think, which is different from the one that's been presented right now. I just want to make that clear, in the sense that there's a critique of postmodernism that goes into the clarity of the authors and is basically saying that it's a pseudo-philosophy that produces strings of text that might or might not be meaningless. Then there's the Petersonian critique, that it's something like postmodernism is practically a conspiracy. There was a malevolent intent in these philosophers who wanted to corrupt society because they were envious or jealous or had some reasons, it's not clear what their reasons are, but there is this malevolent basin at the basis of how these philosophers acted, and they purposefully created things in such a way that they made moral relativism and epistemic relativism fashionable to, I don't know exactly to reach what goals, but it's not a problem of clarity in a sense, because Peterson tends to not accuse philosophers in the continental tradition of not being clear. Actually, he talks about Heidegger, he talks about Nietzsche, he talks about these philosophers in a way as if there's a clear interpretation to the things they say, and maybe he has the right interpretation. I don't know, but I would doubt that, in the sense that nobody seems to have right interpretations on some things. And he brings forth this critique of postmodernism based on this, I don't know how to call it, but it's the fact that they were purposefully trying to introduce these relativistic aspects in society to corrupt it for, I don't know for what aim it was, but yeah.
I guess I tend to think that Peterson hasn't really engaged with postmodernism in any real kind of depth. And what I mean by depth here is not like wasting his whole life reading all first order texts or something, but I mean even just reading, like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page characterizing it, or a very short introduction book or something like that, because I think in his exposition he gets a lot of things wrong. I don't think that this is just unique for postmodernism, though. I actually think this about basically all of the philosophers he names drops. Like, he loves to name drop like Kierkegaard and Kant and Hume and things like that, and he's typically wrong about all of what they have to say too. And this is because I think the one book he has actually read is Stephen Hicks' Postmodernism Explained, which is, very, very wrong historically, mischaracterizes, I would say, almost every philosopher under the sun, from, Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas through to Richard Rorty. So, I mean, that's why I think there's some strange things, some idiosyncrasies in the types of sentences Peterson will say. I think his characterization of what's wrong with the postmodernists, he actually connects into his like metaphysical view, which is sort of, quasi-religious Jungian psychology with archetypes and things like that. Yeah. And so I do think that he thinks that there's sort of like these good religious archetypes, right, of people who are aiming at the good, trying to do good. They, they tend to be sort of more kind of patriarchal. They accept a natural ordering in nature of, they recognize that the feminine essence is slightly chaotic, and so they try to let men take. There's all sorts of these things that I think are built into his view of the archetypes. I mean, one could obviously adopt a view of archetypes that didn't have those things, but Peterson himself is certainly explicit in, identifying the feminine with chaos, masculine with order and things. Now, when it comes to how he describes then the people he disagrees with, like the postmodernists, I think he kind of views them as being oriented towards evil or something like that. I think he would say they're sort of like possessed by these bad archetypes. I'm not sure exactly the language that he'd use, but he'd tie it into his understanding of like John Milton's Paradise Lost and Satan's, his interpretation of Paradise Lost being like Satan's in love with his intellect so much that he rebels against God or something. And so I think that Peterson would view these...
But what's the reason? I'm asking because I forget. What's the reason why Peterson characterizes them as evil or malevolent? So what's their goal? What are they trying to bring about?
I think
it's just evil for the sake of it.
Well, sort of. I think he would just... I don't know how he would characterize it exactly, because I don't think there's that really clear of an explanation here. I think that the explanation kind of ends at, for some reason, they're oriented away from the good, because they're so in love with their own intellect, and so they're rebelling against God. But I don't think there's a plausible story here about why would they have done that? Why would they have gone from presumably not being in that state towards being in that state, right? I don't really know. I mean, recently he had this interview with this guy who I don't know who the guy was, but he was peddling, there's this kind of like this conspiracy theorist that Marxist, well, I consider it to be a conspiracy theory, that Marx was actually a Satanist. And I encountered this in the works of a pastor called Richard Wurmbrand, who wrote a book called Marx and Satan. But this guy who Peterson interviewed was sort of like repeating all of the same points, right? And that they'll point to these specific letters that Marx sent to his dad, where he talks about deconverting from like Judaism. And then there's a play that Marx wrote called Ulanem, which is Emmanuel backwards. And the idea is that, it's satanic to do an inversion. And so this is some kind of evidence that he was satanic, that he puts Emmanuel backwards or something. And also Marxism really, really bad. So how can it not be satanic is kind of like the overall thrust of the argument. But yeah, like, I don't think that there's really good explanations of like, well, why does someone like Marx go from, being a good Jewish boy who cares about the good to, identifying with the bad? I don't really know. Like, I mean, my understanding of what happens with Marx is that he goes to Manchester, sees this like literally child labor in cotton mills and things, and is like, this is bloody awful. And his worldview starts getting shaped, which I would construe as even like being in line with Christianity or something, right? You might think the plight of the suffering of the poor. So I don't know what Peterson's story is for why these people chose evil, but apparently they did choose evil in his view.
Okay.
And I guess rather straightforwardly, I view this as an example of demonization of people that someone disagrees with, so as to not really engage with what they have to say. I think I think it's straightforwardly false in a number of ways. Yeah.
Okay. Well, just to be clear, if it was the case that postmodern philosophers were producing nonsense, I think that would be an evil act. I mean, I'm just to be clear, being coherent with my argument that I was saying before. Now, I think it's different than purposefully doing it to bring down the ruins of society, than just a way to get by in academia, or to mystify your thought, to purposefully obscure a text of knowledge. Yeah, that is evil. Evil is a loaded word to talk about it. It's immoral. Okay, it's not something that you should do. So, I mean, just want to say this for the sake of my other argument. So, yeah, I would just agree more with the other critique of postmodernism than the Petersonian one, because I can't really understand it, and there's some gaps in it with it. Although I do think if I were to because it's one thing interesting between me and you, but you don't know about me, but I know about you, is that we've both been influenced by Jordan Peterson, as I think the majority of people do in politics. And so he, in a way, made me question my era of moral relativism. He was one of the first figures to make me question the things in my era of moral relativism. But I didn't adopt his religious worldview. I went another direction. But he was an influence on, I think, a lot of people who talk about politics. But sorry, I'm rambling off some other tangent. The postmodern part of his critique, I think, one thing he might get right is that this is an idea I'm flirting with at the moment, is that if it's true that some people obscure and write things purposefully to, I don't know, to persuade things of a political orientation. And we see examples of this happening in continental philosophy. I think about Giovanni Gentili, about Heidegger in some sense, that there were philosophers of fascism, and there were philosophers of communism in a way. And these belonged to the continental tradition. They weren't postmodernists, but they belonged to the tradition in which, in some cases, people have criticized them for being obscure. I can see a link between being obscure and try to push things through sophistry, in a way, through persuasion, with bringing about wrong thought patterns in people in the real world that then lead to actual harm, in the sense that people will vote for fascism or for some authoritarian dictator because of these bad thought patterns that are used in the philosophy. So I do see that link. I don't think he makes this explicit in the way I just said it. I don't think it's even Peterson's. Maybe this has nothing to do with Peterson in a way. But I do sometimes share the worry that philosophy is very important for society, in a sense. Like, there is something very important about philosophy for how we understand culture as a whole, in my view. And that is something that Peterson harps on, and maybe that's something I'll salvage from what he says. But I agree with other things you said, that I don't understand exactly how does the evil come about, and what's the goal after they made society this hell on earth. Then what have they obtained?
Well, I think Peterson himself, right? He appeals to people like Panzram here, and he goes, yeah, clearly, when Charles Panzram was asked why did he try to start a war between the USA and the UK by trying to scupper a Royal Navy ship in New York Harbor, he just said, I just wanted to see the world burn or something. And so I think Peterson's painting this picture of people who just hate things and they want to see the destruction of stuff, and then he's painting all of his enemies with that kind of brush. And I don't really think that that's true, though. In line with that, there are clearly some political groups of people and some like schools of thought that you can point to that were more politically engaged or whatever, in the sense that they might have had some agenda to try and influence politics or shape people's thoughts so they'd vote in certain ways, whatever. And I think you can point to that on all sides of the political spectrum at different times. But I don't think to paint all postmodernists with that is really a good idea. And I'll mute myself because I think there's another siren. Another stabbing in Lewisham.
No, you have to have one of those donation runs with like new goal. Get me out of this neighborhood.
Maybe one day I'll move out of central London. The next job, the next salary bump.
Well, okay then. I'll definitely, if you want to keep in touch and just
absolutely, more than welcome.
Critique me on something else, I'm here. And if you have other questions or otherwise,
Yeah, I'm pretty happy there. I've put the link to your channel in the description, and also, but I do need to put timestamps for this video because obviously I've not finished it yet, so I've not done that. If people have timestamps they want me to include, please put them in the comments. You know, like the video anyway, do all the engagement stuff so it gets promoted more.
Lovely.
Cool.
Lovely.
Right, I'll end it there then.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you.